Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Keith St. Clair. I teach at Grand Rapids Community College. I received a grant last summer to go to Central Asia, and where I had the opportunity of visiting Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan, stands that used to be part of the former Soviet Union. And so I wanted to share what I learned with you today. This is the region of the world that we're talking about. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, right between China and Russia. Formerly part of the Soviet Union before that empire broke up in 1991. The Soviet Union, of course, was an extension of the old Tsarist empire that preceded it. So Turkestan itself is refers to a large territory where people who speak the Turkic language reside. And East Turkestan is actually part of China today, Xinjiang province in China. And the northern part is known as Dzungaria, the bottom in the south, Tarim Basin. It was annexed by the Qing or Manchu dynasty of China in 1762. And the primary nationality that's associated with it is the Uyghur population. And they are Turkic-speaking people that even today reside within China, although many of them are facing oppression by the Chinese government as they fight for survival of their culture. West Turkestan was part of the old Russian Tsarist Empire and then later the Soviet Union when it became a communist country, and consisted of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and for much of history ruled by a Turkic-speaking people. And these lands are named after their titular nationality that resides there. The only one that's not Turkic is the Tajiks are not a Turkic-speaking people. They speak a variant of Persian, which is in a completely different language family. Actually, Persian is actually an Indo-European or Aryan language in the same language family as German and English, whereas the Turkic language family comprises many of these other languages. And so Turkestan would have consisted of East Turkestan, which is now in China, and West Turkestan, which was part of the Russian Tsarist Empire and then later the Soviet Union. Of course, when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, many of these countries became independent and are now independent states. And so they're the ones that I really want to talk about. Now, I said that many of them speak a Turkic language. The Turkic peoples migrated from East Asia west throughout over the last several thousand years. Even the country of Turkey today has a Turkic-speaking people there, and they're very much related to the Azeris who live in Azerbaijan and to their ethnic cousins, the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, the Turkmen, and the Kyrgyz. Historically, going back to even BC, this region was famous for having in part been part of the Persian Empire and then later conquered by Alexander the Great. And so although this is in German, but Khorasan province would have made up part of Iran, what is today Afghanistan, Transoxania, or sometimes called Sogdiana, over the river here, and then Khorasim over here. And part of Khorasan province, a large part of it, is part of Afghanistan, and this portion would have also been known to the Greeks as Bactria, named after the river Balk and the city Balk, which was on it. The Greeks called it Bactria. And camels were a major mode of transportation across this territory in what later became known as the Silk Road, as silk was prized by Europeans and traveled from China all the way across the Asian continent to the west. And they used both Arabian camels or dromedaries, as mentioned here, which are one-hump camels, and Bactrian camels associated with Bactria in Afghanistan, two-hump camels. The Bactrian camels are better suited towards winter, but the Arabian camels can carry more. This is the Oxus River, what's known as the Amu Darya today, but in Greek times, when the Greek Alexander the Great conquered it, it was known as the Oxus River, the Gold River. And that land that was on the other side of it became known as Transoxiana, across the Oxus River. And so Transoxiana lies between two major rivers. It's on the other side of the Amu, or Oxus River, and south of the Jaxartes, or what is known today as the Seir River. Darya being the word for river, historically known as Sogdiana. And the people there, known as Sogdians, they were very much linguistically related to Persians and therefore also the Tajiks. So here you have a map of Transoxiana highlighting the two major rivers, the Amu Darya, historically known as the Oxus, and the Seir Darya, known as the Jaxartes. And the land between, like I said, had been conquered by the Persians and then later Alexander the Great. And it encompasses some of the historic cities of Samarkand, and we'll talk about that city in a moment. And this region, which I think for many Europeans seems exotic, associated with nomads throughout history who conquered it. Of course, the Mongols being amongst them, and then later the Turkic peoples as well. But it certainly was important to Western civilization. Here you have Al-Khwarizm, who was where we get the name algorithm. He was the one who, a great mathematician. He wrote the book Algebra. And then Avicenna, the great physician, also lived in this region. And Timur, or Timur the Lame, or sometimes known in English as Tamerlane, who was a Mongol, a Turkicized Mongol, descended or related to Genghis Khan, who ended up creating a fabulous empire long after Genghis Khan was dead. Genghis Khan conquering the region around the 13th century, Timur conquering much of it in around the 14th century. And this was the size of his empire. And he even invaded much of the Middle East. And he was on his way to invading China when he finally died. In the wake of him, later we get various khanates. The Mongol word for king was Khan, ruler. And so you have various monarchies springing up, many of them Turkic speaking, because the Mongols weren't really interested in bringing their culture. They just wanted to rule. But the Turks, it was the Turkic culture that were allied with the Mongols that really had the lasting impact as far as the culture. And Khiva, one Khanate, Bukhara, based on the city of Bukhara, and then the Khanate of Kokand up here were the three main ones until the Russians finally conquered it in the 19th century. And obviously the Russians came in from the north. This area was often referred to as the battlefield of the Great Game between the Russians and the British coming up through India, who were trying to vie for control of this region. And of course the Chinese, who were much weaker at the time, trying to play a role. So these three khanates are of historical importance, and they finally were conquered by the Russians in the 19th century. The Khanate of Khiva in Khwarizm, the Khanate of Bukhara in Transoxiana, and the Khanate of Kokand in the Fergana Valley, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so historically, because the Russians were successful in conquering them, the influence of Russia, even today, politically, diplomatically, very important. The largest cities are actually the Russian former colonial capitals that they ruled this area from. And a lot of the Central Asians who live here have relatives working in Russia, sending back money, working in the Russian economy and sending a lot of their help. Kind of like migrant workers here in the United States sending their money south, maybe to Mexico or South America. Many of the Central Asians are, who are younger and urban are more likely to understand Russia to the extent that they want to work in Russia. None of these states that I'm going to talk about have so far endorsed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Nevertheless, they are very close with the Russian government, and they have been reluctant to condemn it. I think they're reluctant to endorse it primarily because they fear the same may happen to them. There are historic border disputes between them and Russia, and some of them more than others worried about a Russian incursion into their territory as well. In fact, because of the war in Ukraine, many Russian goods, capital, and labor have fled Russia and gone south into what used to be a part of their empire in the Central Asian states. And so you have many Russians coming south into these countries, and they're bringing with them their money, which is causing inflation, and but they're also bringing skilled labor, which is encouraging economic growth too. In 2023, China finally replaced Russia as Central Asia's largest trading partner. So China's influence has certainly been growing. So let's take some of these countries in turn. So this is the flag of Uzbekistan. And so this is the country of Uzbekistan. It's bordered with Turkmenistan just south of it, and Kazakhstan to the north of it. This area is the Karakum Desert. This is the Kizilkum Desert. Karakum means black sand. Kizilkum means red sand. And it just shows you how arid this area of the world is. The further you go west or east, the more mountainous, forested valleys and the more water from frozen glaciers that are present. But the further west you go, the drier it is. And you see here that Uzbekistan is strangely shaped, and it has this arm that goes into what is known as the Fergana Valley. It's interesting, to get into this valley, you basically follow the course of the Sirdarya River, and you have to go through Tajikistan, unless you want to go over the mountains here, which you can. But you go through Tajikistan, and then you get to the Uzbekistan portion of the Fergana Valley. And then, of course, there's the Kyrgyzstan portion of the Fergana Valley. And in part, I think this is it was intentional on the part of the Russians, because they designed these borders when they incorporated these lands, and they created their constituent states that made up later the Soviet Federation, and prior to that, the Tsarist Empire. One wonders if they purposely drew these boundaries to put these people in agitation with each other so that they wouldn't unite against Russian rule. Because certainly there has been ethnic tensions between them, and violence has broken out, especially in the Fergana Valley, between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, and between Kyrgyz and Tajiks. And you can see here from this area that even parts of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan are somewhat separated from, not contiguous with the rest of Uzbekistan. So in Uzbekistan, you have about 37 million people. It's one of the larger of the former Soviet stands. The vast majority of people in all of these countries are going to be Muslim. But there's a surprising large number of Orthodox Christians. Most of these are Slavic, and the vast majority of them are ethnic Russians who are continuing to live there. So in Uzbekistan, the vast majority of the people who speak Uzbek, but you also have Tajiks, Kazakhs, some Russians, and then some Karakalpak, which I'll talk about in a little bit. It's one thing that the Uzbeks and the Tajiks specifically were the more settled of the people, the less nomadic of the others. They settled earlier. The other ethnic groups remaining more nomadic later. And the Uzbeks and the Tajiks lived in close proximity to each other. In fact, I think I mentioned that what is much of Uzbekistan used to be known as Sogdiana, and the Sogdians were linguistically related to the Tajiks. Now, 55% of the population is under 25 years old, and that's pretty much, you're going to see that in much of these countries, a very youthful population. As far as GDP, Uzbekistan, $102 billion, which is pretty respectable as far as the other stands that it competes with. But even it relies on a lot of remittances. 14% of its GDP coming from Uzbeks living in other countries, primarily either Kazakhstan or Russia, sending back money to their families in Uzbekistan. Much of Uzbekistan's energy comes from fossil fuels, of which it has a lot: oil, natural gas, and then some of it through hydroelectricity from the rivers. And just a bare majority of its population urban. And you will see how that compares with some of the others later. Cotton and licorice are huge products coming out of Uzbekistan. I think it's the largest exporter of raw licorice in the world. Machinery and clothing are part of its manufacturing. Silkworm production in the Fergana Valley. So certainly much of what was learned from the Chinese and the silk trade was brought through Central Asia. The current president of Uzbekistan, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, he came to power recently in 2016 after the death of the previous president, Islam Karimov, and it has had a dramatic impact on Uzbek society because under Karimov, Uzbekistan was a closed society. It was a pretty brutal dictator. Now, Mirziyoyev is much more enlightened. He's embraced more liberal ideas, but even he's starting to pull some of that back as he's adopted some authoritarian tendencies later. But I would say generally an improvement on his predecessor in that he ended the closed society of Uzbekistan, he opened its borders, allowed in foreign journalists, embraced free trade, privatization of the economy, introducing liberal reforms, some freedom of the press, and generally punishing corruption. He later then changed the Constitution to allow his presidency to continue until the year 2040. So we're seeing some backsliding a little bit in his authoritarian ways as he's seen, as he's liberalized the country and then he's gotten more protest. He hasn't exactly liked the protest he's been seeing. And then he recently had a law passed that provided up to 5 years imprisonment for anyone who criticized the president. So we're definitely seeing some backsliding there. His predecessor, though, was much worse. Under Islam Karimov, who ruled from the independence from the Soviet Union all the way up to 2016 when he died, he had a very strong forced labor policy. Cotton production, the government had a monopoly on. And about 14% of the cotton pickers, including children, were press ganged into bringing in the harvest by local officials. Now, Mirziyoyev has ended this practice, ended the monopoly of the government, and raised the pickers' wages up to 170%. So again, relatively speaking, better than his predecessor. Here you have a picture of Samarkand and some of the beautiful ancient architecture of the region going back to the Middle Ages. In some of the mosques, the intricate mosaic work. And this is the dome ceiling in one of the mosques. Very beautiful. And here you have, it's my example of an Uzbek. Some of the people that I met along the way. This was in Tashkent. And Tashkent's subway, modernized by under Soviet rule. And here they are selling in the market sumac, which is a kind of a caramelized syrup from wheatgrass that's boiled. Actually, it's sweet. Here's some Uzbek bread. And this woman I met, who's a Tartar, the Tartars are also a Turkic people, but Tatarstan is actually still part of Russia today. So, but there are Tartars who live, Turkic-speaking people who live as a minority in Uzbekistan. Here's an Uzbek woman. Now, she's got gold in her teeth. That's considered a sign of influence and attractiveness. And so you see some of that. This is the ancient walls of Khiva, of the Khiva Khanate. Here it is at night. And they certainly are trying to capitalize on tourism. The gates of Khiva. And here's an actor portraying the Khiva Khan back when the Khan would have ruled and his entourage. This I wanted to show because it shows the level of the ancient civilizations that existed. Even before the coming of Islam, there was Zoroastrianism. And this isn't a mosque, but you still see some of the Zoroastrian imagery that's used in the tiles of the mosque, and that was pointed out to us. The Zoroastrian was the language that dominated during the Persian Empire in Persia, what is today Iran. And here is an ancient mosque in Khiva, and the pillars dating back. Well, they also have inscribed in them various imagery from the Zoroastrians. So you can see that this mosque was probably built on a Zoroastrian temple, and the architects at the time just simply borrowed the artistic parts of the old temple and just incorporated it in the new, unbeknownst to many of the Muslims who worship there probably. And the more you could tell in Uzbekistan, the more devout Muslims were those who actually wore a white cap on their head. This is a residential area, a more affluent area of Khiva, and she just kind of shows you what some of the homes look like there. And then you have, in the east of Uzbekistan, you have what is kind of the sixth stan that is not an independent country. It's called Karakalpakstan. And Karakalpak means black hats, so it's stan means state or land, so it's the land of the black hat. So this is a people who have autonomy within Uzbekistan in this one eastern region of Uzbekistan. Some of them would want to be independent, but they do not have that political heft at the moment. So I'm talking about the Karakalpakistan would be this far region up here of Uzbekistan. And it's pretty sparsely populated, and because it's very arid and very desert. It used to have what was known as the Aral Sea, which has shrunk to almost nothing, which I'll talk about in a bit. So here's my example of a Karakalpak from that region. Here is what the Aral Sea looks like today versus the border region and what it used to look like. It used to be one of the 4th largest lakes in the world, and it's now become an environmental disaster. Now, how did this happen? Well, the Aral Sea was fed. The water feeds in, but it doesn't go anywhere out. So the water was fed from the rivers that I mentioned. The Amu Darya and the Sir Darya River fed it. The Amu Darya no longer reaches it because of over-irrigation, primarily due to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union tried to grow crops in a very arid region of the world. They needed water, so they just siphoned off the water from the rivers that fed the sea. And then, of course, you have all of the fertilizers and pesticides that were used in growing the crops in this region, which all ended up dumping into the Aral Sea. And so not only did it all dry up, but then, of course, what's left, because it was a saline lake, is salted desert polluted with pesticides and fertilizer. And basically, that's what this explains here. Basically, the depletion began in the 1960s, and the Amu Darya no longer reaches it. The fisheries were destroyed. The farmland became, a salted desert. And it's one reason why the Uzbeks are trying to grow licorice there, because licorice thrives in salt, and it also removes the salt from the soil. So they're trying to grow more licorice here in order to make up for the devastation that has occurred ecologically. But if, we didn't get a chance to visit the sea, but there's nothing really to see. You have, strangely, you see boats in the middle of what is now a desert. They call it, instead of the Aral Sea now, they call it the Aral Kum, the Aral Sand Desert. Here's some of the roads. This was in Karachi, Pakistan, and we were on a big charter bus on this one. I thought this was a bad road when I took this photo. Little did I know what the state of roads that I would see later in Turkmenistan. And this is the flag of Turkmenistan. And on the flag, you see the 5 major symbols of the 5 major tribes of the Turkmen people. There are more than just 5, but those are the 5 largest ones. And historically, they all had their own rug patterns. They're world renowned for their carpets and their rugs. And these symbols would represent their tribe on these rugs. And the Turkmen were nomadic for a very long period of time. It was really the Soviet Union that really forced them to settle down and stop their nomadic ways. Here you have a map of Turkmenistan here, bordered on the Caspian Sea, and then on the southern part of the Amu Darya River, and then it borders the northern border of Iran and Afghanistan, right here. Here's the capital, Ashgabat. And so we traveled across from Uzbekistan to Ashgabat. Turkmenistan is a very closed society. Sometimes it's associated with the likes of North Korea. It's really hard to get into Turkmenistan. And if it wasn't for my travel agency, I would have never gotten in. And even then, we had to wait at the border and for our guide to show up. And if he hadn't showed up, we wouldn't have gotten in. This shows you the various Turkmen tribes throughout not only Turkmenistan, but also in northern Iran and Afghanistan and even Azerbaijan on the other side of the Caspian Sea. And you almost wonder, and I certainly wondered, if really a lot of these nationalities that I'm talking about would have ever really, in some ways, they kind of formulated in opposition to, or maybe because of, the conquest of the Russians. One wonders if these tribes ever would have been united as Turkmen per se if the Russians hadn't have conquered them and they created this opposition culture in response. In Turkmenistan, there's about 5.7 million people, so much less populous. They use the Latin alphabet just like the Uzbeks do, just like we do, right? We have the Latin alphabet. The vast majority of the Muslim. You also have a lot of Orthodox Christians, primarily Russians. And you've got a minority of Uzbeks, vast majority of the population under 30, a GDP of about 60 billion, so less than Uzbekistan. Now, the remittances are 0 because there's no remittances because Turkmen are not allowed to leave and come back. Like I said, it's a closed society, kind of like North Korea, or those remittances are just not reported. And it relies 100% on fossil fuels because Turkmenistan has a lot of oil and fossil fuels. And there's even oil rigs that are in the Caspian Sea. The manat is the currency of Turkmenistan, and the official exchange rate was 3.5 manat to the dollar, but we were able to get 15 manat to the dollar because on the black market rate, because that was, economically speaking, that's the real rate, which was better for us, frankly, as tourists. The current leader of Turkmenistan is Serdar Berdimuhamedov. He was recently made president by his father, who stepped down in 2022. And so you really, sometimes people are referring to this as the first Khanate, because for the first time you kind of have essentially kind of a monarchy where the son has now inherited the leadership of the country from his father. That hasn't really happened in any of the other stands that I'm going to be talking about. And Serdar and his father are not exactly liberally minded, shall we say, especially when it comes to women. Manicures, false eyelashes, Botox injections have all been banned by Serdar, the president. He banned the traveling of women in private cars with unrelated men. Abortion has been restricted to 5 weeks, which for all purposes effectively becomes a ban because many women not knowing that they're pregnant until then. And it rewards women who have up to 8 or more children. Not that everybody's taking them up on that, but any woman who's willing to do that is going to be financially rewarded by the government because they obviously want more people with that pro-natalist policy. Here are some examples of some young grade school, junior high girls who have to wear green as part of their school uniforms. And then high school girls wear the red. Apparently, braiding the hair maybe is part of the uniform. I don't know, but I saw a lot of that. Here is the father of Sardar, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, who I said stepped down in 2022. And he has been president since his predecessor died, maybe 25 years ago. And he's quite the dictator, And many say he's really still running the country because his son seems to be doing whatever he really wants. Berdimuhamedov replaced his predecessor was Niyazov, who died. And Niyazov had his own personality cult, while Berdimuhamedov just created his own personality cult. And he likes to be referred to as the leader of the Turkmen people. And many say he's just the power behind the throne, the power behind his uncharismatic son, who really doesn't like public ceremonies. Gurbanguly loves public ceremonies and is not camera shy at all. And he prizes his Akal Tiki horses, the Akal Oasis, and the Tiki tribe refers to the region where these horses come from, and they are internationally sought after horses. This was his predecessor Niyazov's monument of neutrality for his newly independent Turkmenistan from the former Soviet Union. And at the time, Niyazov had his own statue at the top of this monument, and it rotated wherever the sun was shining. That has been removed. Gurbanguly obviously didn't care for that. He moved the monument and took the statue down and replaced it with another one. And he has instead put his own statues all over the place in the capital of Ashgabat. And in Ashgabat, according to the dictator, every car must be white. If you don't have a white car, you don't get to drive the car in Ashgabat. Why is that the case? I don't know. Apparently he likes white. He wants all the buildings to be white too, because you see all the new structures have to be white marble. There is no white marble in Turkmenistan, so they have to pay to import white marble to put in all these new fancy buildings. And they were quite proud of this supposedly residential area, but I'm told very few people are living there, either because they can't afford it and it's just not practical. So you see this over construction of housing in China's had this problem too, where they've just overbuilt. Here's one of those famous horses that I was referring to. And here's the Karakum Desert, the Black Sand Desert. And we got to stay in a yurt. Historically, yurts, the Turkic people throughout Central Asia always stayed in yurts. This is the inside of the yurt. And of course, camels. Camels are used both for their meat, their milk, their fur, and leather. And these are the roads of Turkmenistan. We couldn't even take a charter bus down these roads. They were so bad. And the vehicles that we were able to use, the SUVs, had to swerve all over the place to avoid the potholes. Half the time, we weren't even driving on the road. We were driving off the road because they would just tear up the vehicles. And all these roads dating back to Soviet times just aren't being upkept or maintained, which is kind of surprising for a country that has so much oil. You would think that they would invest in these roads, which they say they're doing. This is an example of a Turkmen. This was our driver, actually. And this was another white elephant project thought up by Niyazov, who ended up being continued by Gurbanguly, his successor. basically, they're in the middle of the desert. They're going to create a 770 square mile artificial lake up to 230 feet deep in what is known as the Karashore Depression. And to create this lake in the middle of the desert, they were going to divert all this water across the desert through these canals, and to change the ecosystem and to have more accessible fresh water and it just turned out to be a disaster. I mean, critics pointed out that the water was going to evaporate, a lot of it, before it ever really got there. And then, of course, whatever pesticide and fertilizer runoff, you're going to have this similar problem that you did with the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan. And in 2020, they started feeding the water in 2009 under Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, and by 2020, the lake is still almost empty, and it's already cost $6 billion. So kind of a waste, but that is, as I guess that's typical of dictatorships, right? Not really well thought out. This is the Dvarzak crater, which is continually burning. It just shows you that there's a lot of natural gas in this region. It happened during Soviet times that this crater was created as they were digging for oil, and it's just been on fire ever since. They don't bother putting it out, I guess because they've made it a tourist spot for people to come. This is one of the cities nearby. It's known as Yerbent. This was created under Soviet rule, under the Soviet Union, when the communists, I was told, people were volunteered to live there. So they didn't volunteer, they were volunteered. And they were forced to live there and then work in the oil industry in the middle of the desert. And here's, they've replaced their camels with motorcycles in some cases, and this person's actually carrying a goat on his lap. And they also use the motorcycles to herd their sheep. And this was a Turkmen who actually was a Michigan State fan. So, yeah, so I thought that was, I think a tourist had given him that hat. Anyway, so, all right, so there's Turkmenistan. Moving on to Kazakhstan, which is the largest of the stands that I visited. The capital now is Astana in the north, but it was Almaty, which is where I happened to go, which is in the Samarikhe region. That was a Russian term referring to the seven rivers that fed Lake Balkhash, and it was a province even under the Tsarist Empire. And the current president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Kazakhstan has about 20 million people. Now they're using the Cyrillic alphabet, which is the Russian alphabet, but they want to switch to the Latin alphabet to be more Western, similar to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which, remember, we use the Latin alphabet as well. The vast majority of people now are Kazakh, but there's a huge minority of Russian population there. Again, much of the population very young. GDP, 263 billion. So Kazakhstan is pretty wealthy compared to some of the others. And it also relies a lot on fossil fuels, of which it has plenty. It is mostly urban. Here you have some of the steppe land of Kazakhstan. And you can kind of imagine the ancient Mongols and Turks riding across this land as they created, this fantastic empire spanning much of Asia. Plov was a frequent dish we were served. We would know it as rice pilaf, basically, but with meat. Here you have a Russian Orthodox Church in the former capital of Almaty, and signifying the number of Russians who were still there. This is a Soviet monument to the Second World War, and many Kazakhs ended up volunteering or being forced to serve in the Second World War fighting the Nazis, and many of them are proud of that, as are their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. This one posing here for the picture, and next to the eternal flame. Here was an Uzbek, ethnic Uzbek who's a citizen of Kazakhstan. There he is with his wife. So there's a minority of Uzbeks. There was a need for Kazafication in Kazakhstan. When Kazakhstan became independent from the Soviet Union in 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, the Kazakhs had a problem because the Kazakhs were a minority in their own country. And the Russian population was almost the equivalent of the Kazakh population, roughly about each 40%. And so the new leader, Nazarbayev, he basically had to secretly try to figure out how to increase the number of Kazakhs in his country so that the Russians wouldn't do what they're doing in Ukraine. One of the arguments for why Putin invaded Ukraine is because there's a large minority of Russians living in Ukraine. Well, you could say the same about Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan, the lesson is not lost on Kazakhstan. This is a threat. So without alienating the Russian population, Nazarbayev did what he could to try to increase the number of Kazakhs, and he offered generous home loans and cash grants to Kazakhs who were living outside the country, be it in Russia or in Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan, to come back or migrate, whether maybe they'd never lived in Kazakhstan, but he wanted them to migrate to Kazakhstan and increase the population, the Kazakh population of his country. It's been very successful, actually. Like I said, when they gained independence from the Soviet Union, the Kazakhs were only about 40% of the population. They're now about 70% of the population. And he's also tried to settle a lot of these new Kazakhs north on the Russian border, because that's where most of the Russians live, to solidify Kazakh claim to that land. And that's one reason I think he moved the capital, which was in the south, Almaty. He moved it north to Astana to make it closer to the Russian border, to again solidify Kazakh claim to what many Russians might consider maybe should be a part of Russia. And then, of course, the Kazakh birth rate is higher. Russians just aren't having as many children, which is another reason why they're part of the population. And many Russians have left, too. And, it's true of many of these states that many Russians, after these states gained independence from Russia, many of them chose to go back to Russia in the 1990s. They migrated to Russia, so a lot of Russians left. Obviously, a minority still remained. But here you have some of the examples of the Kazakhs in the museums that I went to. And as far as the economy, Kazakhstan produces a lot of uranium, triple that of Canada, as a matter of fact. It also produces a lot of lead and copper. 90% of its oil production, when it's exported, has to go through a pipeline that goes through Russia. There's been a lot of talk about building a new pipeline and having it maybe to go to China and then maybe go through the Caspian Sea and bypass Russia so that the Russians don't control a lot of that oil that's exported from Kazakhstan. And then of course, they have American company. They call this Kazakh fried chicken instead of Kentucky fried chicken, although they certainly knew that it originally meant Kentucky fried chicken. All right, the Caspian Sea, that's over here. It borders Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has a lot of oil. And the Caspian Sea is also suffering. And the fear is that it might go the way, in some ways, that the Aral Sea went. A lot of the waters, even the Volga that feeds into it, has been over-irrigated. Canals siphoning off a lot of the water, so the water level of the Caspian Sea is dropping. They're having to dredge some of the ports and to get some of the oil out. Tajikistan, the next one. This is their flag. The word Taj means crown, which I think is one reason why the crown is on their flag. This is the map of Tajikistan. As you can see, its northern arm goes into the Fergana Valley, which I've talked about before, but the rest of the country, very mountainous. Some of the Pamir Mountains, some of the highest mountains in the world. The Tajiks are a Persian-speaking people. Like I said, they used it at one time, and to some extent still are. You find them in Uzbekistan, Tajiks everywhere. But before the coming of the Turkic-speaking people, they ruled much of this area. Now they have been relegated to this portion of Central Asia, and now they are a majority, at least in their own country. This is their current president, Emomali Rahman. He has been president ever since Tajikistan has gained independence from the Soviet Union. So he's the longest serving dictator, in essence. Tajikistan has 10 million people. There's a large number of Uzbeks as well. 12% of the population, 2/3 of the population is under 30. GDP, 12 billion. So a much poorer country than many of the others that we've talked about. The last two I'm talking about are probably the poorest. Tajikistan, and the last one will be Kyrgyzstan. Now, a lot of its energy, though, comes from hydroelectricity because it has these mountain glaciers, the water runoff, they're dammed, so they're able to get electricity from all the dams that they're able to create. Look at the large number of remittances, 38%. So there's a lot of Tajiks outside the country sending back money to their relatives back home. Here are some of the high mountains in Tajikistan, but most of the Tajiks live in the valleys, especially the river valleys. And these are some of the villages. Tajikistan is predominantly rural. And so agriculture is of primary importance. And here we met this farmer, and he's basically using some of these old, what would have been homes in the 19th century for Tajiks, which is he's now using them for his livestock. So we see some ruralization instead of urbanization. You see some ruralization in Tajikistan, primarily because the rural areas have a higher birth rate than those living in the urban areas. So we see the rural population increasing relative to the urban population. And major exports are gold, cotton, aluminum, so a lot of mining in these mountains, as well as villages growing food stuff. This is one of the markets in the local villages. I thought this was rather ingenious in how he's using mountain runoff water, cold water, which is basically raining down on all of this stuff that he's selling to keep it cold. So instead of that, this is his outdoor refrigeration, if you will. These were some of the drivers, the Tajik drivers. Remember, these are ethnically different than most Turkic-speaking people because the Tajiks speak a variant of Persian. Persian, much more closer to European languages. And so in Persia, which is today Iran, they speak Persian, or Farsi as they call it. In Tajikistan, they call it Tajik. And in Afghanistan, they call it Dari. But it's all essentially dialects of the same language. So they're all mutually intelligible with each other. And the Tajiks have a very strong affinity for their Iranian cousins, their Persian cousins living in Iran. But unlike the Persians living in Iran, Iranians are mostly Shiite Muslims. In what is Central Asia and Turkestan, it's Sunni Muslims who predominate. And even in Tajikistan, although the Tajiks are linguistically related to their Iranian cousins, most Tajiks are actually Sunni Muslims. And I remember in class I've talked a lot about that, which is worth remembering actually, that the Shiites, they believe that the authority for the faith should be a blood descendant of Muhammad, where the Sunnis did not accept that the authority for the faith, the Muslim faith, needed to be a blood descendant of Muhammad. There are only 4 countries in the world where Shiites are in the majority, and those are worth knowing: Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and Bahrain. All other countries where Muslims live, Sunni Muslims are in the majority. And in Tajikistan, it's Sunni Muslims who are in the majority. So here we are again. Tajikistan, their Dari-speaking cousins in Afghanistan, and their Persian-speaking cousins in Iran. And like I said, the Persian-speaking people once dominated all of this region before the Turkic people migrated in from the east. So one more country, Kyrgyzstan. Well, I guess before I get to that, I guess I want to talk a little bit more about the policies of Tajikistan. There's been a crackdown on Islamists. A lot of Islamist radicals have been coming in from Afghanistan. And there was a civil war that occurred in Tajikistan right after Tajikistan gained independence in the 1990s. And the government was able to put it down. And since then, there's been a crackdown on Muslim extremists. The Muslim Party has now been banned. Call to prayer is not allowed over the loudspeakers. People who do the Hajj to Mecca, the pilgrimage to Mecca, have to be over 40 years old. Women and children are not allowed in the mosques. So the government is very wary of the threat of religious extremists. And in fact, the Islamic State of Khorasan, which you may have heard of, is the ones who attacked, well, they're the ones that had killed the American soldiers as we were leaving Afghanistan. It wasn't the Taliban, it was the Islamic State that attacked us then. They have been active in Tajikistan as well. In fact, there was a bombing, I think, in Russia and Moscow recently that was blamed on Tajik immigrants, radicals. There's a collective security treaty organization, kind of their version of NATO with Russia, consisting of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Belarus, and Armenia. A mutual defense pact, so to speak. Unfortunately, it hasn't prevented the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks from fighting each other over their border disputes. And recently we saw 41 Tajiks killed and 59 Kyrgyz dead as fighting broke out along the border, and 130,000 Kyrgyz were forcibly displaced from their homes. This is the flag of Kyrgyzstan. This is the map of Kyrgyzstan. So you can see the Fergana Valley is kind of enveloped by two arms of Kyrgyzstan. The capital of Kyrgyzstan, Bishkek, up here on the Kazakh border. This is the current president, Sadir Japarov. Kyrgyzstan, small country, sparsely populated, 6 million people. The majority are Kyrgyz, but they also have a large number of Uzbeks. GDP is about 14 billion, so just a little bit more than Tajikistan, but these are definitely the two poorest of the ones that I talked about. Maybe Tajikistan a little worse, because Tajikistan has more people and its GDP is a little less. Again, much of Kyrgyzstan uses hydroelectricity from the dams that they've made from the water runoff from the mountains. Here's some of the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, some of the terrain. And it seemed like these Kyrgyz hats are like the national uniform. You saw these hats all over the place in Kyrgyzstan. The Kyrgyz woman. And these were some musicians who performed for us. And this was a ethnic Russian who was born and raised in Kyrgyzstan. So again, there's Russian minority there. And again, don't think that what they see happening in Ukraine makes them a little nervous, knowing that there's significant Russian minority in these countries, and they wouldn't want Russia to all of a sudden say, you know what, those Russians should be living in Russia and the land with them. And the Russians that I did talk to in Kyrgyzstan, boy, did they just have Vladimir Putin's talking points. I mean, they were all like, yeah, they felt bad for Ukraine, but Ukraine shouldn't have started the war. You know, it was like, it was their fault. They threatened Russia, and just everything that, contrary to fact, really. I mean, not really emphasizing the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine, not vice versa. In Kyrgyzstan is a history of populist movements. I must say that when it comes to action of the people, Kyrgyzstan has the best representation there, going back to even before the Soviet Union. The Russian Tsar, there was a revolt during World War I in 1916. The Kyrgyz people rose up in rebellion against the Tsar, and they were brutally put down. I mean, 1/6 of the Kyrgyz population killed. 1/3 of the Kyrgyz population had to flee the country to China, where many Kyrgyz still live in the Xinjiang province. It was horrific. Perhaps that experience maybe explains why, of all of the stands when the Soviet Union broke up, Kyrgyzstan was one of the most eager to declare independence from the Soviet Union. And after 2001, the Kyrgyz actually built a military base for the American Army. And they also built one for the Russians, so the Russians wouldn't be left out. Eventually, they would close the American base and keep the Russian one. In 2005, you had what was known as the Tulip Revolution, where corruption of the dictatorial government caused the people to rise up in protest and rebellion, and they forced the leader and the president to flee the country. That has happened several times since then. So of all of the countries I mentioned, Kyrgyzstan has really had the most success of getting rid of their leaders. But I'm not, their current leader, though, is not necessarily a model of behavior. So that's a memorial to the 1916 rebellion. Some of the mountains. Their current president is very much a populist and a nationalist, and he seems to be engaging in some of the historic corruption. So we'll see if maybe he can tame his populace, or if his populace will once again overturn him. Here's some of the steppe land in Kyrgyzstan. And Kokboro is a game that Kyrgyz, well, actually many Turkic people play this, where it's on horseback. Instead of a ball, you use a goat carcass. And the purpose of the game is to throw the goat carcass into the opposing team's goal. And these nomadic games are played. We got the chance to witness that. And I was surprised to learn there's even an American team in the nomadic games that play this. I had never seen it. Here we got a demonstration. They didn't just play that game, but they also played other games on horse, showing off their horseback skills. Here, they had to pick up a bag of coins from the ground and from the horseback without losing control of the horse or falling off. And here I am holding the goat carcass. And this thing was heavy. I mean, it was like 50 pounds. They cut the head off and the legs and sew it up and then use that as the ball, so to speak. And here they are actually playing. Let's see if I can go. You can see, I don't know if you can see that one of them has the goat carcass and he's going to go toward the enemy goal, throwing it in. And the other ones are trying to wrestle the goat carcass away from him. Yeah, score. No. Anyway, that concludes my talk. I'm certainly willing to open it up to questions if there are any. What was my favorite part of the trip? I don't know, staying in a yurt in the desert was kind of cool. I did like that. Of course, I just like learning. So as a student, I was just fascinated with all that I was taking in. I love history. So even though I'm not a history professor, I do love history. And so I was just eating all that up about Tamerlane and the Mongol and the conquest of old and the Khiva and Bukhara and Kokand Khanates and learning about the great game in the 19th century between the British and the Russians. There were two British diplomats who were imprisoned in Bukhara by the Bukharan Khanate, and when the British lost the war in Afghanistan, he obviously saw that an opportunity to just execute them. And they died in the bug pit of Bukhara, as kind of infamously known. And so I had heard about those stories, and to actually be in the prison where that happened was kind of fascinating. So anything that put me in touch with the history that I've read about before, I certainly enjoyed. Yes? What's my experience with camels? Yeah, they are mean, actually. They will spit in your eye. So, yeah, you got to be careful with them. But I did not ride any camels this trip. I have had a bad experience riding a camel before. I kind of wrenched my back as I was foolishly on a camel in Morocco, turning around trying to take a photo of the guy behind me. And I forgot that the vehicle I was on has its own mind. And when I was twisted around, the camel got up and torqued my back. And so, yeah, I still go to physical therapy for that. But maybe it would have happened anyway. I'm just old, so that happens, right? So maybe I don't know how much to chalk up to that experience, but that was my negative experience on a camelback. That was over 10 years ago. Yes? Oh yeah. Do you think did we get cheated? Did I? you know you've seen the game played with 100 people at once? Yeah.
And it's like a.
Well, now you made me realize maybe I did get cheated. Maybe we really didn't. Maybe I didn't really experience the game as it's meant to be played. I did not know that. Well, I wouldn't have known any different. But now you've got me wondering. Yeah. Thanks for popping my bubble. I thought, wow, I got to see the game played. But maybe that was really just a sample of what it's really like. Yes?
You said, I forgot where, but you said the roads were terrible.
Yes.
Where do you place those next to Michigan roads?
Oh, beyond anything. I mean, I know we like to complain about Michigan roads, but nothing like I saw that. I mean, like I said, in Turkmenistan, half the time we couldn't even drive on the road. We had to drive off the road. And because we made better time off the road than we did on the road. And then when we were on the road, I don't know if you saw that photo, but we were just weaving back and forth, trying to follow the path of the vehicle in front of us, figuring that they knew the best way. And but it was definitely serpentine because you couldn't just drive straight on the road, or you'd blow a tire for sure. It was just some of those potholes were just incredible. And it's not just the heat, right? It's also the truck traffic on those roads, driving the oil trucks, that they go out to the oil fields. And so you can blame the trucks, which I think we can in Michigan too, right? The trucks are primarily the reason why the roads are getting torn up. Yeah.
How much was the grant, and did anything come out of your own pocket?
Yeah, a lot came out of my own pocket, but the grant was significant. I'm very grateful to the Grand Rapids Community College Foundation. They gave me $5,000 to travel for 3 weeks to Central Asia, and then I picked up the rest, which was about another $4,500 on my part. So they paid for almost 60% of it, which I was very grateful for. Yeah. Well, I guess that was Bukhara. Samarkand was amazing.
The wall was really cool.
I love those ancient walls of the city of Khiva. I think Khiva was my favorite, just because it was so picturesque.
Yeah.
And now it's such a tourist town, of course, but it just really puts you back in what it was. I just kind of felt like I could envision what life was back, like hundreds of years ago, and I love that. Yeah. Yes?
Were there differing opinions in each one of these Central Asian countries, or how differing were they on their view of American people as a whole?
You know, I thought they were very friendly and welcoming of America. I mean, it's not like I can't think of a reason why they'd be pissed off at America. At the same time, I know why they're very friendly with Russia, because not to be friendly with Russia is a real worry for them. On the other hand, they're also wary of Russia. So I think the fact that they're so far from the United States doesn't seem to be doing anything that's really ticking them off. Although I suppose if you were a very religious extremist in these countries, you probably are not a fan of the United States. But frankly, most people in these countries, these countries are primarily secular countries, even though they're predominantly Muslim, pretty secular. Not a lot of religious extremists, and many of them were actually kind of supportive of us in our war in Afghanistan, because the majority population in Afghanistan are Pashtun, and the Taliban primarily represent them. But there's a lot of Uzbek minority and Tajik minorities in Afghanistan who have been mistreated by the Taliban. So there was some affinity for the U.S. in that regard. Yes?
Talking about the leaders of each of the countries, it seemed like they each had their own flaws. So did you have like any conversations with the people, and did they express either like how much they either disliked or liked their leaders?
Not really. When I went to Turkmenistan, I was specifically told, do not ask political questions of anybody. But I did anyway, because you know me. And the guy I talked to, who was quite old, he was an old guy, older than me, and he was kind of had mixed feelings when the Soviet Union broke up, because he had a Soviet pension. And when Turkmenistan became an independent country, he lost his Soviet pension. So his whole retirement was gone. And so he didn't really want to see Turkmenistan become independent. But at the same time, he wasn't exactly in love with Russians either, because he told me about his uncle who had fought in the Second World War. And he was a Turkmen fighting in the Russian army against the Germans, and he was in he ended up getting captured by the Germans. He escaped from the Nazi Germans back to Russian lines, but the Russians put him in the punishment battalion for that, because you weren't supposed to surrender to the Germans. And the punishment battalions were the first ones into all the combat situations. They were the cannon fodder. And so you weren't supposed to get captured. You were supposed to save one bullet for yourself so that you wouldn't be captured. And so he survived the punishment battalions. And then after that, after the war was over, he was sent to a gulag in Siberia, where he was imprisoned for years. And then he was finally released to go back home. And of course, the day he was going back home, he mysteriously died. Yeah. So I mean, that's what it's like growing up under Stalinist communism and in some of these authoritarian countries. And he's got a dictator in his own country, right? And I asked him, I was trying to take pictures of some of the dictator statues. And I was getting police coming up to him, they were making, you delete that. And I was like, for crying out loud, okay, I deleted it. And but I'm like, he's got all these magnificent statues of himself, why wouldn't he want his picture taken? And I asked the Turkmen that, and he's the old guy, and he's like, Keith, it doesn't make any sense to me either. I don't get it. Why do we all have to drive white cars in Ashgabat, the capital? If you don't have a white car, you don't get to drive in Ashgabat. I mean, dictatorship, let's avoid it. Not good. Yeah. Hey, thanks for coming. I'm going to conclude now, and I know some of you, if you want to hang out a minute, we can talk about class, but I'll call that a wrap. Thank you.